great Sphinx of Egypt, keeper of the ancient mysteries, guardian of the ancient secrets. The Sphinx is considered to be the greatest statue on Earth. Good evening. I'm Charlton Heston. Every 100 years or so, an idea comes along that can shake the world. An idea so revolutionary that at first no one believes it could be true. When Galileo showed evidence that the Earth moved around the sun, the authorities arrested him. Many people refused to believe that the Wright brothers could fly, even after they'd been doing it for 2 years. But eventually, if the evidence is convincing, a theory can be accepted as common knowledge. What you're about to see could be history in the making. Tonight, we go to Egypt to examine the controversial theories of John Anthony West. West and his team of scientists challenge our long-held views about the origins of the Great Sphinx. They suggest that the Sphinx was carved before Egypt became a desert, 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. It's remarkable that for thousands of years, the evidence has been in plain sight, yet till now, no one has recognized its significance. If West's theories prove to be correct, the implications are staggering. We've been taught that the people who inhabited Egypt during that early period were primitives who survived by hunting and scavenging for food. John West believes that this view is incomplete. He feels that an entire chapter of man's early history is missing. West's team has uncovered new evidence which suggests that we're descendants of an unknown earlier civilization, an advanced culture capable of incredible technological feats. Tonight we'll examine this evidence to see if man's early history needs to be rewritten. Could the legends of Atlantis be true? Egypt, land of mystery. The symbol of her enigmatic culture, the Great Sphinx. For thousands of years, travelers have visited Egypt and stood in awe of these great monuments. Of all ancient civilizations, none has left behind such a wealth of artistic and architectural mastery. These magnificent temples were the inspiration for the artists of ancient Greece and Rome, who in turn passed their knowledge on to us. But who inspired the Egyptians in the first place? History has no answer. On the easternmost boundary of the Sahara Desert, 6 miles west of Old Cairo, the Sphinx and surrounding pyramids rest on the edge of the Giza Plateau. 240 feet long, the length of a city block, 60 feet high, the height of a 6-story building. The Sphinx has the body of a lion and the head of a man. It was carved in one piece out of solid limestone bedrock. It rests in its own enclosure, facing east to catch the first rays of the rising sun. Egyptologists who specialize in ancient Egyptian dynasties now believe that the Sphinx was carved by the pharaoh Chephren in his own image 4,500 years ago. Chephren is the pharaoh who is credited with building the second of the 3 major pyramids in the Giza Plateau during what's known as the Old Kingdom period. For over half its known life, the Sphinx has been buried up to its neck in sand. Despite this protection from the elements, the body of the Sphinx is deeply eroded. Although it's been dug out and repaired many times, nothing has ever been found to tell us who built the Sphinx or when. This is John Anthony West, author and independent Egyptologist. While researching the work of French mathematician Schwaller de Lubitsch, he made a chance discovery that would change his life. Schwaller made the simple observation that the Sphinx had been eroded by water, not by wind and sand, as traditionally believed. These are two very different types of erosion. Water in the Sahara Desert. There's been no significant rainfall in the Sahara for 9,000 to 10,000 years. West was the first person to grasp the implications of this. If the Sphinx was eroded by water, it had to be at least 9,000 years old. The deep erosion is easy to see, but it takes an expert to identify its cause.
Through some friends, I had an introduction to a very well-known Oxford geologist, and I went into him with a very simple question. On the basis of a clear photograph alone, could he, as a geologist, tell the difference between weathering by water and weathering by wind and sand? The answer was cautiously expressed as a general rule, yes. I asked him if he didn't mind if I play a bit of a trick on him, and what I did was I took a photograph of the Sphinx and I masked off the head and the paws, and I asked him what did he think that was responsible for that weathering. And he looked at it a moment and said, well, unquestionably, water. And then I stripped the masking tape off, and he looked at it a minute, and he said, oh.
The Oxford geologist realized that if the Sphinx was more than 9,000 years old, the entire history of ancient man would have to be rewritten. He wanted no part of such a controversial subject. In his book, Serpent in the Sky, West first published his theory of an older Sphinx. Scholars laughed and ignored him. West needed an ally, a recognized expert willing to examine the evidence with the courage to stand behind his conclusions. Dr. Robert Schoch is an associate professor of science at Boston University. He holds a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale University. Dr. Schoch is an expert in the erosional analysis of rocks.
What I found was that West had one very extreme idea that the Sphinx was thousands of years older than the Egyptologists thought. So I thought it was a long shot. I thought maybe West was onto something I thought was very improbable, but it was worth looking at further. I'm a curious type of person.
West and Schoch traveled to Egypt to examine the evidence firsthand. While Egyptologists look at monuments, geologists look at the stones they're made from. And those stones told Schoch that West was on the right track. Schoch was encouraged by what he saw, but the team was totally unprepared for what happened next. Somehow word of their theory leaked out, and they found themselves attacked in the press. This is an American hallucination. They're exploiting the monuments of Egypt for personal gains, said Dr. Zahi Hawass, director of the Giza Plateau. The team is ignorant and insensitive. This from Dr. Mark Lehner, Egyptologist.
There is many theories like this has been said about the Sphinx, but all of it gone with the wind, because we Egyptologists have a solid evidence to state that the Sphinx is dated to the time of Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at the Giza Plateau.
West and Schoch were undaunted by the ridicule. They knew their theory was based on solid evidence. Virtually all of the temples and tombs on the Giza Plateau have been weathered by wind and sand. So why would the Sphinx be the only monument weathered by water? To a geologist, erosion tells the story of a rock's history. The limestone bedrock in Giza is like a layer cake composed of both hard and soft layers. The wind-driven sand scours out the softer layers, leaving the harder layers intact. An example of this is found here in the tomb of Debihen, which is carved out of the exact same rock as the Sphinx. Once a smooth wall, it's been exposed to desert conditions for over 4,000 years. On the other hand, rain weathering has an entirely different look. Rocks which have been weathered by rain have a round, undulating profile. This is very different in appearance from the hard, sharp profile caused by wind weathering.
This is classic textbook example of what happens to a limestone wall when you have rains beating down on it for thousands of years.
It's only found in one area on the Giza Plateau, here, on the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. These man-made vertical walls were carved from the same layer of bedrock, a mere 300 yards apart. According to Egyptologists, they were carved at the same time. But if that's so, shouldn't they exhibit the same pattern of erosion? Dr. Lehner has an entirely different explanation.
Well, Dr. Schock is saying we have the same layer, and here on the Sphinx it's weathered, and here on this Old Kingdom tomb it's not, carved out of the same layer. And we are saying, and I bow to Dr. Gorey on this as a geologist, no, those are two different layers that weather at different rates. It all comes down to that, basically, aside from the massive problem that Dr. Schock has with no cultural context.
When you think of water in Egypt, you automatically think of the Nile. Could the legendary Nile floods have eroded the Sphinx?
Well, that's a nice hypothesis, but it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. What you have here are rocks where the lowest-most rocks, which are a bit softer than the rocks at the very top, jet out further. If it were Nile floods coming in, you would expect these soft rocks to be eroded way back as the waters rose up. You would expect this to be eroded way back, and it should undercut the uppermost rocks. That, in fact, is not what we see. If we look up there, we see a little undercutting where you have a very soft layer, but the next layer above, which is harder than this layer, is receded way back. So no, it's not Nile floods that are causing this erosion. It's clearly rain precipitation causing these erosional features. One thing I think one has to realize is that the Sphinx itself is in very bad shape in the 20th century. It's deteriorating very quickly. You can literally stand in front of the Sphinx and watch stones fall off of it. Smog, pollution, acid rain are all affecting it drastically and weathering it very quickly. And one thing that some critics have suggested is that, in fact, I'm not taking these factors into account, that when I'm looking at weathering, I might just simply be looking at modern weathering features. I just want to assure everyone that I have taken this into account. Yes, it's a very serious problem, the modern weathering, but the weathering that I'm looking at is the ancient weathering, the weathering that we see under ancient repairs, and that's a whole different ball game. That's a whole different set of evidence than the modern weathering.
Schock was certain that the walls of the Sphinx enclosure were eroded by water cascading down off the Giza Plateau. Water whose only possible source was rain. This was the key element in Schock's argument. But when did it rain? Dr. John Kutzbach is a professor of paleoclimatology at the University of Wisconsin. Paleoclimatology is the study of ancient weather patterns.
The first way that we try to determine the climate of the past is by looking at observations. There are plenty of observations from North Africa that show that that region was covered with lakes in the past. Right now it's a desert, but 10,000 years ago there were lakes in the Sahara. Then there's an entirely different way that we figure out the climate of the past, and that's with our computer models. We then can calculate what the change in climate would be like for that time. And the amazing thing is that the geologic evidence and the computer simulations both agree that around 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was wetter than it is now.
Schock and West felt that the evidence of water erosion was so strong, there must be other evidence in the area to support an older Sphinx.
Take a look at this. You can see the rolling, weathering, the precipitation-induced weathering, and here you see very nicely all these joints, which are various fault joints and whatnot. You don't see this same type of joints opening up in the wind-induced weathering. I'm standing in a vertical fissure on the southern wall of the Sphinx enclosure. This vertical fissure was clearly formed by water running down the wall. It would pick out the weak spots in the rock, open them up into these fissures. This is clear evidence to me as a geologist that this erosional feature we see was caused by rain beating down on the rocks. Here is the actual photograph of the back of the Sphinx enclosure. You see the rolling, undulating, weathered profile. Here's a diagram of that same profile shown here, and what you're looking at diagrammatically here are the different beds, the different layers, which you can see in the photograph and see even better if when you're in the field actually walking around looking at. These different layers, some of them are harder, some of them are softer. Professor Gowrie has calculated, in fact, durability factors for the different layers. And the way this works is the higher the durability, the higher the number, like 86 versus 11, the more durable that particular rock is. And so we see some of the rocks which have very low durability factors, say of 11, they are in fact receded back and undercut the rocks above them. So 11 recedes back further than 56. But notice that doesn't work in every case. Some of the more durable rocks, like 76, 75, 86, actually recede back further than some of the less durable rocks, like 42 or 56. If this started out as a vertical or nearly vertical profile, why would these more durable rocks recede back further? I would suggest this is consistent with precipitation-induced weathering, where you have water, rainwater beating down from above, and in fact the rocks that are higher up, even if they're more durable, they take the brunt of more rain hitting them and they recede back further than some of the less durable rocks lower in the section, which are more protected.
If the Sphinx was damaged by rain, and the evidence suggests it was much wetter in the Sahara region 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, then the Sphinx must be more than 9,000 years old. That's twice as old as history tells us. Why had no one noticed this before? When the first dinosaur bone was discovered in 1838, no one even knew what it was. There was no frame of reference for it. No one had even heard of dinosaurs then. As more bones were found all over the world, scientists put the pieces together. Schock and West were now ready to test their theory. They submitted their findings to the annual conference of the Geological Society of America.
There was a single moment that really got the project rolling, and that was actually the moment when we were invited to the Geological Society of America's convention, Schock and myself. We'd put in an abstract. Schock was by this time absolutely convinced that the theory was valid.
It's a basic forum to express new ideas in geology, and geologists, quite honestly, are quick to shoot people down if they find fault in the theories and ideas presented. Much to my pleasure, no one pointed out any errors. In fact, they found the evidence quite interesting, even compelling.
Dr. Schock was being modest. As a result of his presentation, 275 of the attending geologists offered to help with his project. The argument escalated into a battle between two unrelated branches of science, geology and Egyptology.
We're relatively certain of the accuracy of our reconstruction of Egyptian civilization. Because if we were to take the alternative view, think of what we're stuck with. We have an antediluvian civilization with all the trappings of later pharaonic civilization, like the Sphinx, with the characteristic Egyptian headcloth, with the characteristic use of the lion in the guise of the king. And then you have nothing. You have nothing for how long? 1,000 years, 2,000 years? And then it starts up again. Where's the link? What ties this antediluvian culture to what came later? Are you saying that two exactly parallel cultures evolved at the same place 3, 4, 5,000 years apart, it sounds like a Star Trek episode. It simply doesn't work that way. Culture evolves in a linear fashion. To accept the theories that you're purporting means that you've got culture A, culture B, and in between, nothing. And it simply doesn't work that way.
What's actually at stake are the implications, the impact it has upon accepted views of the evolution of civilization. We think, and it's a kind of a spin-off of Darwinian evolutionary theory, that human evolution is a linear process, that it goes from stupid cavemen to smart old us with our hydrogen bombs and striped toothpaste. In fact, the proof that the Sphinx is many, many thousands of years older, that it precedes by many thousands of years even dynastic Egypt, means that, and when that's taken into consideration and you look at the way the Sphinx is carved and the incredible size of the blocks of the temple alongside of it, when you take that into consideration, you realize that there was, at some distant past in history, as the legends affirm, high, sophisticated civilizations. So that's really what is responsible ultimately for the terrific opposition that the idea provokes.
As a direct result of the raging controversy in the press, both sides were invited to debate the question of the true age of the Sphinx. The debate was held at America's most prestigious scientific forum, the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The Egyptological view was presented by Dr. Mark Lehner, considered to be the world's foremost authority on the Sphinx. West's theory was presented by Dr. Robert Schoch, while West watched the proceedings from the audience. Author Paul Roberts, who was covering the debate for Canada's leading investigative journal, had these comments.
West is really an academic's worst nightmare, because here comes somebody way out of left field with a thoroughly well thought out, well presented, coherently described, beautifully written, full of data you can't refute, and it pulls the rug from beneath your feet. So how do they deal with it? They ignore it. They hope it'll go away, and it won't go away. If they'd allowed John West to be on the podium and not be kept off the podium because he doesn't have degrees behind his name, they would have had an even more devastating attack, and they would have been even less able to defend. As it was, they were unable to respond to what Dr. Schoch said.
My own reaction as a non-geologist is I was waiting to see at least some hardcore data that the weathering of the Sphinx is in fact water-induced, induced by periods by rain, such that it has to date during a period when there were heavy rains. I didn't see any evidence. I saw many slides of, yes, this drastically undulating profile of what we call member 2 of the Sphinx, with various people, mostly, various people standing in the view, but I didn't see any data that convinces me one way or another that it is in fact rain-induced. Our reaction is, if it was built by a civilization or a culture that is that much earlier, where is the other evidence of this culture? Show me a pot shard, show me a tomb, show me an inscription, show me any other piece of sculpture, show me any archaeological site that dates to this period.
To say where's the rest of the evidence, as a number of Egyptologists have said, is it's like telling Magellan that the world is still flat because where are the other guys who sailed around it? It's absolutely beside the point. However, I recognize that if the Sphinx dated from that earlier date, you would anticipate that there ought to be something else, whereas if it dates from a time so old that practically everything has been silted over or covered over or in the bottom of what's now the Mediterranean Sea, then you get the idea that you might have to go looking very hard for it, and perhaps even more to the point, look in places where nobody else has looked. One place I would think to look would be wherever the course of the old Nile Valley is. The Nile in ancient times was not in its present course, and wherever the old Nile would be a place to go working with our seismic equipment to see if we could find well under the present silt level remnants of a civilization capable of producing something like the Sphinx.
This is the Osirian, thought to have been built in the New Kingdom 3,400 years ago. Schock and West have found evidence which casts a serious doubt on this conventional dating.
The floor of this temple is a good 50 feet below the floor of the temple of Seti I. Geologically, there might be another explanation for this. I think it's possible that this temple is extremely old. It was built on the ground level, then over thousands of years from Nile flooding, sands and silts were brought in which filled up the temple and eventually covered it completely.
We think this amazing structure may relate to our work on the Sphinx. It's traditionally attributed to the pharaoh Seti I, around 1300 BC, but there's virtually no evidence to support that attribution. We think it's older, maybe thousands of years older. The Osirian looks like it was built in a deep hole dug in the bedrock. This is an unthinkable departure from normal Egyptian temple building practice. The architectural style is unlike anything else in Egypt, except at Giza, the valley temple of the Sphinx. You can see the same massive simplicity, the mighty square granite pillars and the total absence of inscriptions and carvings, all of which produce a very similar initial impression. Could this be more evidence from the same culture that built the Sphinx?
The Step Pyramid at Saqqara is said to be older than the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids at Giza. Like the stones of the Giza Plateau, the mud bricks of Saqqara have their own story to tell.
These are the mud brick tombs of the earliest kings of Egypt, 1st and 2nd dynasty, around 3000 BC, 500 years before Chephryn's time. Now, under any circumstances, the limestone the Sphinx is carved out of is harder than these mud bricks. Geologists agree the weathering to the Sphinx is the result of water, rainwater, over long periods of time. Since we're only 10 miles from Giza, we can assume the weather conditions are the same. These mud brick walls are in relatively stable condition after all these thousands of years. If they'd been subjected to the same rains that weathered the Sphinx, they'd have dissolved long ago. How is it possible that these mud brick tombs and the limestone Sphinx, with channels weathered 2 and 3 feet deep into its sides, date from the same period?
When this photograph was taken in 1860, the lion's body was not visible. If the head of the Sphinx hadn't protruded above the sand, it might not have been discovered to this day. Archaeological excavation is expensive, and permission to dig in Egypt is difficult to obtain. How could West and his team look beneath the sand without digging? The seismograph is connected to listening devices called geophones, which are placed in the ground at precise intervals. A metal plate is hit with a heavy hammer, sending shock waves deep into the ground. These shock waves reflect off the rock layers of different densities. They're received by the geophones and then recorded by the seismograph. The final results give a graphic representation of what lies hidden beneath the surface. Dr. Thomas Dobecki has been a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, and he's worked extensively in the petroleum industry. He's a professional engineering geologist and geophysicist. His specialty is high-resolution seismography.
Initially, our primary purpose for conducting the seismic surveys in and around the Sphinx was to look for buried evidence for ancient civilizations. To this end, we were able to locate unusual cavities that could be chambers within the Sphinx enclosure. But over and above this, we were also able to map the pattern of weathering depth within the limestone.
This rock surface may look rock solid, but it's actually very soft. It's porous, geologically speaking. Since it was cut out, it's weathered in the subsurface. Now, a rock, when it's cut out, begins to weather, and the degree of weathering, the depth of weathering the subsurface correlates very clearly with how long that rock has been exposed.
By deterioration, or weathering as we call it, the rock becomes softer, some of it dissolves, it becomes a much weaker rock. Now, how deeply the weathering goes into the rock mass is much a function of the type of rock, but also, very importantly, how long it's exposed to the elements. Now, seismic refraction enables us to map the boundary between this weak, deteriorated rock and the underlying very hard limestone.
What we found is that north of the Sphinx along the body, south of the Sphinx, and in front of the paws, the rock has weathered down from the surface into the subsurface. It's weathered down approximately 2 to 2.5 meters, in some places a little deeper. We're talking in terms of 6 to 8 feet or so weathering. Behind the rump of the Sphinx, however, it's only weathered about 1.2 meters depth, maybe 1.5 meters in a couple of spots, about 4 feet deep. What this clearly indicates to us is that the rump was carved out later. I think there's good reason to believe that the back was carved out or cut out in Khafre's time, in Chephrun's time, Khafre or Chephrun's time, about 2500 BC. If the other three sides show weathering 50 to 100% deeper, I would expect that that means that the other three sides were exposed or carved out at least 50 to 100% earlier.
Simply stated, the floor in the back was weathered only to a depth of 4 feet, while the front was weathered 8 feet. This suggests that the front of the Sphinx is twice as old as the back. Assuming that Chephrun exposed the back to make his repairs 4,500 years ago, the front must have been carved out at least 7,000, perhaps more than 9,000 years ago. How old is the Sphinx? Egyptologists claim the pharaoh Chephrun carved the Sphinx in his own image 4,500 years ago.
All Egyptologists, and especially everyone who studied the Sphinx, and all the archaeological evidence that we have, dated the Sphinx back to 4,500 years ago, which is the time of Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza. Even Mark Leaner, who's a colleague of mine, tried to make a computer modeling of the Sphinx, and through a statue found in it's now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. With the computer, they found that the face of the Sphinx now exactly looked like Khafre.
A National Geographic article showed the face of Chephrun imposed by a computer on the Sphinx. According to Dr. Mark Lehner, with the face of Chephrun, the Sphinx came alive. Alive. Maybe. But does the face of the great Sphinx even resemble the pharaoh Chephrun? The traditional view says it does. But to John West, that answer was unsatisfactory. He decided to consult an expert, someone who works with faces every day. New York City detective Frank Domingo is one of America's leading forensic experts. A 26-year police veteran, he wrote a manual in the art and technique of facial identification used today by police investigators all across the nation.
If you had those photographs,
if anyone could tell if the Sphinx was Chephrun, it was Detective Frank Domingo.
The faces that I've seen in Egypt are wonderful. There's a whole myriad of different racial types and different types of facial features. And in those features, I've seen elements that I see in the statues from ancient Egypt.
The Cairo Museum was established in 1902. It contains the largest collection of Egyptian art in the world. Statues here in the Old Kingdom room demonstrate the skill with which the ancient sculptors captured their subjects. The eyes of this magnificent wooden statue of Sheikh el-Beled seem to look back at you. The Old Kingdom artists even used various crystals to simulate the refraction of the human eye. Detective Domingo and team photographer Caroline Davies went to photograph and measure the controversial statue of the pharaoh Chephren. Using standard police procedure, Caroline photographed side and frontal views eye level to the statue. These mug shots would be compared to similar views of the Sphinx. In addition, precise measurements of facial features and angular proportions were taken. If the face of the Sphinx was meant to be the pharaoh Chephren, then it should resemble his statue in the Cairo Museum.
One of the questions we often get about Egyptian art is just how lifelike is it? How accurately does it reproduce the physical features of the subjects that are represented? Well, we often hear that Egyptian art is purely symmetrical. You could draw a vertical line bisecting the nose and on a statue, and all the features on the right would be the mirror images of those on the left. But you know what? That's not true. In fact, it's absolutely wrong. If you, in fact, do find a statue that is absolutely symmetrical, where all the features on the right are different from those on the left, you know what you have? You have a forgery. Because the Egyptians were very canny observers of the human condition. They realized that one eye on a face is always a little bit lower than another eye. One nostril may be a little bit larger than another nostril. And they showed those details.
Look at the prognathism on the Sphinx. That's the extension of the lower portion of the face. You won't find that on the statue of Chephren. This statue does not protrude. That's this part of the face.
Frank also observed that the face of the Sphinx is more square, while Chepren's face is more oval. Proportionately, the mouth of the Sphinx is larger, while Chepren's mouth is a little finer. The eyes of the Sphinx are quite large in comparison to those of Chephren. After completing his initial observations in Egypt, Detective Domingo returned to New York to analyze his findings. Does the Sphinx look a little worried to you? I wonder what the penalty is for impersonating a pharaoh. A procedure for measuring proportions, angles, and shapes had to be established before a comparison could be made. Comparison of the facial shapes was made more difficult due to the severe damage on the face of the Sphinx. Nevertheless, Detective Domingo established enough points of reference to make a comparison with the statue of Chephren possible. These points were the chin, the outer corner of the eye, and the brow ridge. While a study of the frontal view showed significant differences, the comparison of the lateral view was decisive. When the reference points in this lateral view were connected with vertical and horizontal lines, the difference of angles on the two works was extreme. The most conclusive finding was the angle between the outer eye and the vertical. In Chephren, that angle measured 14 degrees. But on the Sphinx, the angle was more than double, 32 degrees. This explains the protrusion of the lower jaw found on the Sphinx, but not on Chephren.
After reviewing all the measurements, angles, and proportions, it's my conclusion that the Great Sphinx of Giza is not the same individual represented in the statue of the pharaoh Chephren.
If the Sphinx isn't Chephren, who is it? Some eminent visitors over the years, among them Gustave Flaubert, thought the Sphinx was black African. According to Zulu history, in ancient times, their people inhabited northern Africa. When the rain stopped and the region became Sahara, the Zulu migrated south. This view now has some support. In his detailed report, Frank Domingo suggests that the face of the Sphinx is consistent with typical African facial structure. After the New York Times published its op-ed piece on Domingo's work, orthodontist Sheldon Peck wrote a letter, independently arriving at the same conclusion. Orthodontists work with facial bone structure on a day-to-day basis. Wouldn't that be a twist on history? If the face of the Sphinx was meant to represent a black African king or queen.
It is interesting that the Zulus, in their myths and traditions, identify their beginnings with the planet Mars. There was a great war, and the most beautiful women were placed upon what they called the Maracaiba, the spaceship that brought them from Mars to this planet. It is interesting that this word is very similar to the Hebrew word Merkava, which means the divine vehicle used by the angels or higher intelligence in visiting the human creation.
All the monuments on the Giza Plateau are carved in stone, but some of the theories explaining them are not. One of the main arguments that the Sphinx was carved by Chufrin is found on this granite stela. This tablet tells how the Sphinx appeared to Thutmose IV in a dream and promised him the crown of Egypt if he would remove the sand that covered it. The hieroglyphics read, "Look at me, Thutmose, my son. I am your father Horus in the horizon. To you I turn my face and heart for protection, since I am sick in all my limbs. The sands of the sanctuary on which I rest have covered me." Thutmose cleared away the sand and indeed became king. But what does this stela actually say about Chefren? On the bottom of this tablet, there once existed a few of the hieroglyphs that make up Chefren's name. They've since flaked off. But nowhere does the stela say anything about Chefren carving the Sphinx. Egyptologists continue to use this circumstantial evidence in their argument that the Sphinx was carved in his lifetime. On the other hand, here's another piece of circumstantial evidence which would have proved West's theory if scholars had chosen to accept it.
Here's a tantalizing but inconclusive piece to the puzzle. This is the inventory stela. It relates how King Cheops, predecessor to Chefren, built a temple to Isis alongside the Sphinx. This means that the Sphinx was there before Chefren's time. The stela, however, is a later version of an earlier document. Scholars argue over the authenticity of the information it contains. There is, however, good reason to believe that information is authentic.
The inventory stela has a very unique inscription. It is a piece of fine white limestone, some 70 by 42 centimeters. In layman's language, it refers to Khufu, the father of Khephren, is the one who creates the temple next to the cavity of the Sphinx. Clearly, this throws into question the origin of the Sphinx. It points to a much earlier point of time. Scholars have rejected this because of the modern stylized Egyptian writing, but this would be like throwing out the King James Bible simply because it is in modern English, overlooking the prime revelatory source of cosmology and theology.
The ancient Egyptians were masters at building with large blocks of stone. Visitors from all around the world are still impressed by these magnificent structures built thousands of years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza is perhaps the most famous example. 2.5 million blocks of limestone are stacked 480 feet high. The average weight of the blocks is 2.5 tons. The interior chambers are lined with blocks which weigh up to 70 tons each. As impressive as these numbers are, there's an even greater mystery, which until now has been completely overlooked. In order to expose the body of the Sphinx, enormous blocks of limestone were quarried out. Block by block, the stone was removed as the lion's shape took form.
I'm standing here on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. This is a massive limestone temple that was built contemporaneously with the Sphinx. We know that because we can look at the rocks that this is made out of, and we see that it has exactly the same layers, exactly the same lithology. In fact, we can determine that these blocks came right out of the Sphinx enclosure. They actually carved out massive blocks which they moved to in front of the Sphinx and reassembled as the Sphinx temple. And the size of these blocks really is enormous. How were they able to move these huge blocks with, quote, primitive technology? How were they able to assemble them into this temple? It really awes and inspires the imagination.
Some of these blocks measure 30 feet long, 10 feet high, and 12 feet wide. They each weigh 200 tons. That's roughly the weight of a diesel locomotive. Nowhere else in all of Egypt are blocks this size used in the construction of temple walls. The question is, how were these giant blocks moved onto the site, then raised and precisely fitted into position 50 feet above the ground? Egyptologists maintain that it was done with ramps, levers, ropes, and a lot of manpower. To put the problem in perspective, John went to a Long Island construction site to see how today's engineers lift and maneuver heavy loads. A crew of 20 men had been working for 6 weeks to prepare for the lift of one object, a 200-ton boiler. This crane is one of the largest land-based cranes in existence. Its boom reaches 220 feet into the air. A concrete counterweight of 160 tons is required to keep it from tipping over. A second crane was needed to precisely fit the boiler into place.
I'm looking at what you're showing me here, these pieces, and looking at the distance involved. I don't know if we would be able to pick if any of these are 200 tons from the position that I see available to us. I mean, I've looked at these over the years because in my business, you know, when we pick heavy loads, we look to see how heavy loads were picked by other people before us. And seeing how they move these heavy blocks, 200-ton blocks, possibly thousands and thousands of years ago, I have no idea how they did this job. It's a mystery. It'll probably always be a mystery to me, and maybe to everybody.
If modern engineers have a problem maneuvering blocks of that size, how were the ancient builders able to do it? Was it possible to move 200-ton blocks into place using simple levers, as Egyptologists suggest? Or did they possess a technology that our science is only beginning to understand? A technology based on the vibrations of sound? Project director Boris Said demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians understood acoustic principles, and they incorporated them in their architecture. This broken obelisk still resonates when it's struck, like a giant tuning fork. The Bible tells of the Battle of Jericho. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with a ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city shall fall down flat. Were the walls destroyed by sound? Some of you may remember this famous commercial.
Can the amplified voice of Ella Fitzgerald shatter this glass? Believe it.
Clearly, sound can affect matter, but can it levitate a heavy object? For many of us, this is levitation. But the scientists at a space age research facility outside of Chicago have a different definition of levitation.
Acoustic levitation is a non-magical way of floating an object in midair using very loud sound. The levitation that we do is done by having one or two sound sources and a reflector, and the sound bounces off the reflector, and on its way back down, the two sound fields pass through each other. In that region where there's the interference of those two sound fields, there are little wells that you can actually levitate small objects the size of a pea in. I'd love to go to Egypt, but lifting the block is a little beyond what we can do currently. The frequency required is much lower than we can produce at sufficient intensity, and the reflector that you'd have to have above the object would be approximately 1/4 of a mile across.
Today's most advanced science can levitate a small rock, but nothing that compares with the blocks in the Sphinx and Valley temples. The fact remains, these 200-ton blocks of stone were somehow raised and fitted together with great precision. No one today knows just how this was done. If you look at the Sphinx, you may notice that the head seems too small for the body. Detective Domingo reasoned that if the Sphinx was carved in the shape of a lion, it should be consistent with the proportions of a real lion. Although much of the Sphinx has eroded away, Domingo found 4 valid reference points for his comparison. And those points confirmed that the base was indeed in correct proportion to a lion's body. But the Sphinx has the head of a human. When Domingo compared the dimensions of the Sphinx to a typical Sphinx at the Cairo Museum, he found that their bases were also in correct proportion. Why then were the heads so different? Domingo speculated that because the original head was already so eroded by rain, it had to be recarved in order to create the face we see today.
The symbol of the Sphinx uniquely brings together the Sphinx as the guardian of knowledge, the sentinel of the opening of the door to higher knowledge, the power of human nature, that is to say, the face of human intelligence, connected with the body of the lion, the forces of nature that are put in balance with that of the solar system or the greater notion of life in the universe. All 3 themes are brought together in one. It is the perfect symbol of initiation into life eternal.
In the days before cameras and video, people had to rely on the descriptive abilities of those intrepid tourists who actually got to see the Great Sphinx. These descriptions were sometimes very poetic. For centuries, the mysteries of Egypt have drawn visitors from all over the world. Benjamin Franklin, Napoleon, Florence Nightingale. They came to enjoy the culture of ancient Egypt. Today, travelers find a country which is still rich in tradition. The Egyptians are warm, friendly people. Some of them masters of the fine art of bargaining.
I prefer Nefertiti. She's more beautiful than Tutankhamun.
But of course, it's really the monuments they're coming to see. The Egyptians consider them to be the heritage of humanity. They generously share them with the entire world. Restoring and maintaining these treasures is the enormous task of the Egyptians' Antiquities Organization. Dr. Saeed Hagazi voices his concern.
You know, we can say that we live in the present, but we also live in the past. There is much that we can learn about ourselves by studying the past. These monuments are the past, and they must survive for hundreds of years so new generations can know them. These temples have been deteriorating for centuries. It's our duty to protect them against further destruction and to do our best to restore them.
It was here in Luxor on a casual tourist visit in 1937 that R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch conceived of the notion that this strange asymmetric ruin behind us, the Temple of Luxor, was in fact an exercise in harmony and proportion. Since both these were supposedly Greek inventions, Schwaller decided to stay in Luxor to test his hypothesis. For if he could prove that harmony and proportion were available to the ancient Egyptians, it would mean that exact mathematical, scientific knowledge existed a full 1,000 years before the rise of Greece. Over the course of 15 years, Schwaller measured and mathematically analyzed this temple structure. He found that it was based on strict geometrical and harmonic proportions. Through his observations, Schwaller discovered that the walls, columns, and sanctuaries tell the story of the creation of man and his relationship to the universe. The very proportions of man are embodied in the floor plan of this monument, which is why Schwaller called it the Temple of Man. Could the complex knowledge expressed in this temple, which we're only beginning to grasp today, be a legacy from the builders of the Sphinx and its temple complex? For those who visit this sacred site, it evokes a strange vitality, which can be unsettling yet exhilarating. Architecture has been called frozen music, and Luxor, even in ruins, is a symphony in stone.
To the thousands of tourists who visit the Sphinx every day, it appears to have been built from blocks of stone. In actuality, the blocks were used to repair the heavily eroded body of the Sphinx. For West and his team, these repair blocks contain a valuable clue which other experts have not taken into account.
The deeply weathered body of the Sphinx has been repaired many times throughout the course of its long history. Each of these repair campaigns has its own individual style.
Here's the tail of the Sphinx, and right above it, various repairs. Right on the tail, different styles, different types of repairs. This is obviously a much older repair block. These are more recent ones, 20th century repairs. Egyptologists have determined that some of these oldest repairs date back to Old Kingdom times. So this statue, this magnificent monument, has had people working on it, repairing it for the last 4,500 years.
Here we're looking at a cross-section of the repairs. In order to restore the Sphinx to its original lion's form, 2 to 3 feet of repair blocks were necessary.
Egyptologists tell us that the earliest repairs to the Sphinx were made during the Old Kingdom, and this period ended around 300 years after Chephren died. This presents a problem. If Chephren carved the Sphinx, why would it need repairs after only 300 years? They say that the stone the Sphinx is carved from is of such poor quality that it eroded 3 feet in 300 years. That's an erosion rate of approximately 1 foot every 100 years. The Sphinx, we're told, is 4,500 years old. That totals 45 feet of erosion. Since the Sphinx is only 40 feet wide, it would have completely disappeared 500 years ago.
One explanation for the formation of the Sphinx was provided by Farouk El-Baz, a world-renowned Egyptian geologist. He noticed the very ancient water-weathering patterns on the body of the Sphinx and suggested that the Sphinx was a yardang. A yardang is a landform shaped by natural forces, such as wind-driven sand. These forces, according to El-Baz, gave the landform its basic shape, which the Egyptians merely modified to create the Sphinx we see today.
And he shows this diagrammatically. Here's sort of a lump of rock that was sticking out of the desert. The winds flow around it, start to shape it, make it look more and more like a sphinx. And then the Egyptians came and touched it up a little bit to make it into the sphinx we see today. Relative to the yardang hypothesis suggested by Farouk El-Baz, I really don't think this holds under close scrutiny. One reason is, as you look at the Sphinx enclosure, and here we see the rear of the Sphinx enclosure, the Sphinx is cut out of the bedrock, and the ditch, the enclosure surrounding it, is very tight, it's very narrow, and it has these sharp right angles in it, as you see here. It's very hard to conceive of how natural processes would cut it so tightly and cut these sharp right angles. Furthermore, the blocks, at least some of the blocks that were cut out of the Sphinx ditch, were used to build temples that sit in front of the Sphinx. So it's very hard to conceive of how natural processes would have cut blocks out, removed them, and reassembled them as temples in front of the Sphinx. Also, the head of the Sphinx does sit above the general level of the Giza Plateau in this area, and the head may have in fact originated as a yardang, but I don't believe that the body as a whole was a yardang.
Dr. Hawass has his own ideas about how the Sphinx was made. He describes how the sculptor may have worked in the great statue.
He made the face of the Sphinx, but he found that the whole body is deteriorated. Then he cased the Sphinx with rocks, with limestone, and after that made the carving.
In other words, the limestone was so deteriorated that the sculptors had to repair the body while they were carving it. Dr. Schock carefully examined the stone and came to a very different conclusion.
You look at these blocks, you can see the strata, you can see the fossils, the nummulites. This is exactly the same rock as the Sphinx enclosure. Really a fairly nice limestone, good, solid, certainly capable of using it to build a structure like this. Certainly not the situation where it just powders and crumbles immediately upon cutting it out. If that were the case, they wouldn't be able to use it to assemble a temple like this.
According to Schock and West, by the time Chephren became pharaoh, the Sphinx was already highly eroded from thousands of years of rainfall. Chephren didn't build the Sphinx, he repaired it. He also repaired the Sphinx and the Valley Temple, which were already highly eroded when he became pharaoh. How do we know this?
This is an inscription found on the granite of the Valley Temple. In style, it is typical of Old Kingdom work. Roughly translated, it says, "Beloved of, living forever." What it says to us, however, is that this granite was here in Old Kingdom times. Now, we've established that the limestone core blocks of the temple are much older than this granite. If this granite was here in Old Kingdom times, the temple itself must have been built considerably earlier. This is a side view of the Valley Temple, one of the sides of the Valley Temple. It was stripped of its granite ashlars some time ago, and they were used to reconstruct and to build other structures in the Cairo area. And what you see under the granite ashlars is this rough, higgledy-piggledy surface, and what I interpret this as representing is the ancient Egyptians had a weathered surface on a very old temple. They cut it back just a little bit to get a more competent surface before covering it with the granite ashlars. But they didn't cut it back enough to make a nice smooth surface.
Now this is what I mean by the two-stage construction. You see the huge limestone core blocks that come from the ditch that was quarried out to free the Sphinx, and the granite sheathing that was added later. You see exactly the same thing over here with the granite sheathing and the limestone blocks on top. And my contention is that the limestone core blocks originally had that rolling weathering that you see on the Sphinx. The weathering was cut off, and the granite was then married to the limestone core. Now,
I agree.
Can you as a geologist tell if the limestone is actually pre-weathered? In other words, if it's old limestone when the granite is put on?
Yeah, I think so, because on the other side where the granite facing has been removed, you can see the limestone surface very clearly, and you can see that there was an old weathered feature there, which was just sort of skimmed down, cut up down a little bit in order to put the new granite on it. And in fact, the back of the granite was cut to fit the old weathered surface. So it's impossible to have built it all at one time and get that effect. You had to put the limestone there first, let it weather for a long period of time, and then marry the granite to it.
Yeah, my feeling was this was an important piece of the puzzle.
I think so.
Let me show you another one.
Okay. This is a picture of a wall of the Valley Temple, and you can see, for instance, here how the granite seems to have been cut to meet the weathered limestone, the older limestone surface. This two-stage construction of the Sphinx Temple and also the Valley Temple is something that greatly impressed me on my first trip to Egypt and led me to believe that this project was worth pursuing further.
When Cheffrin's stonemasons refaced the two temples, they needed room to work. They cut back the limestone bedrock, creating the sheer wall.
This vertical wall is what the walls of the Sphinx enclosure would have looked like originally. Now, traditional Egyptologists argue that this wall was carved out at the same time as the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, and also at the same time as this wall, made out of the same material. This is a wall of the Sphinx temple. Notice how eroded it is. In fact, this is not even all of the original erosion, because some of it was cut off by the ancient Egyptians, we believe, when they restored this temple. Now, my contention is that clearly this wall and the nice vertical wall that we see here, plus the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, these could not have been made at the same time. Clearly, the more heavily eroded walls are older than this vertical wall.
What you've just seen is the result of 17 years of research. To visualize how this new information fits together, we've created a computer graphic sequence to illustrate the possible life history of the Sphinx. Long ago, before Egypt became a desert, the Giza Plateau was a fertile savanna. At the very edge of this plateau was a large outcrop of natural rock. A group of sculptors, taking advantage of its prominent location, carved this rock into a gigantic face. Originally, it may have been the face of a lion, or it might have been the face of a god, or the face of a queen. To create the lion's body, blocks of limestone were quarried out, forming an enclosure around the Sphinx. Somehow, these huge blocks were transported and lifted into position, creating the Sphinx and Valley temples. Time passed. Shifting weather patterns brought torrential rains to the area, signaling the end of the Ice Age. The rains eroded the Sphinx to virtually the state it's in today. Could this have been the great flood described in the Bible? When the rains stopped, the vast, once fertile savanna became the Sahara Desert. The wind-blown sands filled in the heavily weathered enclosure and buried the statue up to its neck. This thick blanket of sand protected the Sphinx from further erosion for thousands of years. But what about the face? Almost certainly it's been recarved, maybe several times. Since nothing's been found to identify the Sphinx, we may never know who it was meant to represent. Under the reign of the pharaoh Chephren, the Sphinx was uncovered and the first of many repairs was begun. Time passed. The desert reclaimed the Sphinx. 1,000 years later, Tutmosis IV again uncovered and repaired the great statue. This cycle was repeated several times over the next 3,500 years. There are many stories about how the Sphinx lost its nose. Some legends suggest it was Napoleon's army. Others say that Arab gunners were to blame. According to ancient lore, you could kill the spirit of a statue by destroying its nose. But the spirit of this great statue lives on. The computer recreation we've just seen illustrates the history of the Sphinx, according to Dr. Schock and John West. But it doesn't address the question, who built the Sphinx?
I think our initial investigation around the Sphinx was very successful from a couple of different perspectives. One, we got hard defensible data on the degree and the nature of the weathering of the limestone surrounding the Sphinx, all of which supports Bob Schock's theories. But even more exciting and more interesting to me is the unexpected discovery of several large cavity features around and under the Sphinx. This is a fairly large feature. It's about 9 meters by 12 meters in dimension and buried less than 5 meters in depth. Now, the regular shape of this, rectangular, is inconsistent with naturally occurring cavities. So there's some suggestion this could be man-made.
Man-made. It's very interesting. Keep that in mind for just a minute. There have been many predictions about the role the Sphinx would play in our future. One of the most compelling was by this man. Edgar Cayce gained popularity in the mid-40s as America's sleeping prophet. In deep trance, Cayce revealed detailed information about ancient Egypt. 50 years ago, Cayce predicted that a chamber would be found under the front paws of the Sphinx. This chamber, he said, would contain records of the civilization that inspired the entire Egyptian culture. He called that civilization Atlantis. According to Cayce, the Atlanteans were a technologically advanced society who fled to Egypt when their continent of Atlantis sank into the ocean to be lost forever. Fantasy, wild dreams, maybe. But the unexpected cavities detected by the seismograph were located precisely where Edgar Cayce said they would be, under the front paws of the Great Sphinx. A seismograph does not dream.
If the Greeks were inspired by the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were inspired by the mythological Atlanteans, then who inspired the Atlanteans? One of the most unusual and intriguing ideas I found in my research is the possible connection between the Sphinx and the planet Mars. In 1976, NASA sent 2 Viking spacecraft to Mars to photograph the planet and test for the presence of life. 2 of these photographs revealed a large human face accompanied by a massive 5-sided pyramid. Some call the face the Martian Sphinx. These findings were presented at the United Nations to an audience of scientists and journalists. Here's an excerpt from that presentation by Richard C. Hoagland, science writer and winner of the Angstrom Medal for Excellence in Science for his research in the Mars investigation.
Artifacts. And in 1976, during the unmanned mission to Mars, the Viking mission, lo and behold, on frame 35A72, taken on an afternoon on Mars of a northern Martian desert called Cydonia, we, the human race, NASA, the United States of America, the American people who paid for the mission, spotted and noted an enigmatic artifact that did not belong, the so-called face on Mars. Now, many things have happened in the ensuing years, but I wanted to show you the original data to show you how far we have come, because, of course, the official response when this photograph was first presented to the media and to the world was that it was, in fact, a trick of light and shadow. Well, from that has come an investigation, some books, some videos, a lot of discussion, and we are here this afternoon. Now, this is a computer-enhanced version of exactly the same image done 15, 16 years later. Notice the remarkable level of detail, cross lines on the forehead, scalloping on the left side here, the suggestion of teeth in the mouth, deep-set eyes. But again, if we only had one picture, we would never know if, as NASA has said consistently for 16 years, this was merely the most marvelous trick of erosion on the surface of any planet, or, in fact, was something else. For that, you require another set of data, such as this. This is now a second frame taken 35 days after the first frame. And DiPietro and Molinari, two imaging engineers at the Goddard Space Flight Center who got into this very early on in 79 and 80, they were the ones, not NASA, to cull through the 60,000 Viking images in the archives and to find this picture. And when they processed it, lo and behold, this object turned out to be remarkably bilaterally symmetric. Now, we mean by that it seems to have a left and a right half. There appear to be two eye sockets, the mouth goes through, the hairline appears to go around, there's proportion and symmetry, about 95%. Now, facial expressions we see in mountains or in landscapes here on Earth are inevitably perspective shots, profiles, where if you move 100 meters one way or the other, they go away. What made this different was it was a frontal, full-on facial view, as if you were looking at yourself in some kind of cosmic mirror. And maybe that's a telling metaphor for exactly what this was intended to be, if and when we climbed up the ladder to spaceflight, journeyed across space to Mars, and looked down and saw it staring back. Time will tell. For the last 9 years, the argument has raged regarding the reality of this object as a constructed artifact. Well, our focus has now begun to shift. We're looking more at the meaning of this object, including a possible connection with the Earth. The key to our apparently successful solution to the riddle of Cydonia, which is the name of the region on Mars where Viking initially photographed the face, turned out not to be the face at all, but a 2-mile-long, half-mile-high, 5-sided pyramid located a few miles away. It was Eero Toren, our team member on loan from the Defense Mapping Agency, who cracked the code, because Toren found, when measuring the internal geometry of the D&M pyramid, that it contains incredible geometric structure, fundamental mathematical constants, which in the universe are the key to signifying the presence of intelligence. This is the Sphinx. We're now looking at a structure, a magnificent, monumental work of art created at a time when nobody else on planet Earth is supposedly able to do anything of that magnitude or scale. There's no other contemporary civilization to pin it on. So who did it? And before you say Martians, just sit there and listen, okay? Okay, I don't want you to leap here. Science has now opened. I mean, rigorous science has opened the doorway to what, in I think it was John's parlance, the dreaded A word, Atlantis. Is it conceivable that the mythos that came down to us through Plato, speaking of a prior high civilization capable of things like this, is maybe not a myth? But in fact, we're seeing at least one surviving, albeit very ancient, artifact that you can touch of that halcyon day when we could do things that we no longer can do. Something ineffable brushed an earlier phase of human history and left a monument that recorded in some form the echo of that signal. The basic model of the Sphinx is this lion-man interface. We began to look seriously at the possibility that there was more than a passing connection between this awesome structure and the monuments of Mars. Well, take a look. As you progress through the various imaging enhancements, this is high sun now, all right, you can very definitely see that this guy has a simian proto-human look. What you then do is you take the halves, all right, and you fold over. All right, let me go back one. You fold over this half, all right, onto that half so that you can actually get a mirror image, and it's very definitely primitive hominid. It's not Marilyn Monroe or Paul Newman. Why is it primitive hominid? Might it have something to do with how old we think this thing might be? Circa 500,000 years. Hold that thought. Then what we do is we go back to the original, all right, and we then take the right half and we do the same thing. We fold that over and we get this. And I'm really gratified by your response, guys, because that's exactly my feeling. The hair on the back of my neck. When I realized that what we were looking at in the monument of Mars, the face on Mars, was the fusion of the hominid and the feline, the fusion of this persona. From this, I realized that what we were seeing was, of course, sphinxes, literal embodiments of sphinxes on two worlds linked by the fundamental constants of Cydonia over and over and over again.
The most accepted ideas are sometimes the hardest to overturn. They seem so obvious. The Earth is flat. Man cannot fly. Man will never walk on the moon.
For me, though, the idea of looking back at Earth from deep space and seeing it in a new perspective, that's the most profound experience of the entire space program.
Dr. Edgar Mitchell, ex-Navy astronaut, was one of the few men to walk on the moon.
An example of changing thought structure is the classic one that begins with Copernicus. When Copernicus challenged the existing notions that all the heavens moved around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of creation, and it didn't appear from his observations that was true. And so he invented or created the heliocentric theory that said all the planets move around the sun. And that was certainly resisted at the time. Fortunately, Copernicus was a rather wise man. He didn't challenge the existing system till he was near death, and it was published after his death, as a matter of fact. It was Galileo that came along with his telescope and saw planets moving around, like moons moving around a planet, and suggested that maybe Copernicus was right, that Earth was moving around the sun. Unfortunately, the authorities of the day didn't want to even look through Galileo's telescope. They were quite confident they knew the answer without looking at new evidence. If geological evidence and dating evidence suggest that the Sphinx is much older than we previously believed, it raises great questions for our concepts of how humanity evolved over the last 100,000 years. If geological evidence and dating evidence suggest that the Sphinx is much older than we previously believed, it raises great questions for our concepts of how humanity evolved over the last 100,000 years. Those are pretty well established notions as well. So if the Sphinx is proven to be much older, it raises a huge question mark as to what sort of sophisticated civilization could possibly have existed to create this monument.
There is simply not a single shred of evidence that has been presented by any competent Egyptologist that suggests that there was any high culture. before the pre-dynastic period. Can we have missed it? Sure, we can have missed it. I could also grow wings and fly back home tonight, but I think the probability of that happening is just about as good as the probability of us having missed the evidence of such a high culture. Archaeologists, you have to remember, are not the sort of Indiana Jones with the bullwhip and set the dynamite charges kind of people that the films portray us to be. They're very meticulous workers who pore over every scrap of material that comes out of the ground. They don't use picks and shovels. They use brushes and scalpels to scrape away the dirt and to examine what's there. You're talking about an enormous amount of care that is put into the work that archaeologists do, and I doubt very much that the hundreds, the thousands of Egyptologists who've worked in the Nile Valley since, let's say, the 1880s would have missed even one little bit of evidence for such a purported earlier civilization.
Many archaeologists and Egyptologists have been highly resistant to my ideas. If my findings are in conflict with their theories, maybe it's time for them to reevaluate their theories about the rise of civilization. I'm not saying that the Sphinx was built by Atlanteans or people from Mars or extraterrestrials. I'm just following the science where it leads me, and that leads me to conclude that the Sphinx was built much earlier than previously thought.
Schock and I have a friendly debate going about the age of the Sphinx. Schock holds to his 5,000 to 7,000 BC date, mainly by taking the most conservative view allowed by the data to hand. I think, for a variety of both intuitive and scholarly reasons, that the date is much, much older. Schock isn't even in disagreement about this, but he prefers to take the most conservative view. I think that when and if our isotopic analysis and other areas that we're working in provide a date that, or provide data that we think is trustworthy, that date is going to be very, very old indeed. I think older than 10,000 BC, really older than 15,000 BC, and it wouldn't even surprise me if the date was a lot older than that. I really do believe that when we get a date, it's going to be something so staggering that nobody's going to believe the data.
West and his team have presented compelling new evidence that the Sphinx was eroded by rain. Now, does this prove that the Sphinx and its temple complex are thousands of years older than history tells us? The geology says yes, but we need more evidence. Recently, scientific techniques have been developed which could shed new light on the mysterious cavities under the Sphinx. West and his team are presently awaiting the invitation of the Egyptian government to continue their investigation. What is it about this legendary guardian of sanctuaries that continues to fascinate mankind?
Well, this Sphinx is one of the best-known images in the universe. I mean, everybody knows about the Sphinx. It's certainly the symbol of Egypt. And I think it's a symbol of mystery and intrigue. And there's something very magical about the Sphinx. And I think everybody that looks at its image feels that mystery and that magic.
I'm a typical scientist slash engineer that I love my data, I love to play with my data, and I love to see what it's telling me, and ensuring that what I'm producing is the best possible product. But now you take that to saying that something that I did with a sledgehammer and trying to avoid camels and horses may have some impact on how the world looks at its own past history. It's kind of mind-boggling. And like I said, that hasn't settled with me that much yet.
Each branch of science operates within its own individual paradigm. We're rocking the boat. We're looking at this problem from a new perspective, and we're providing some new and different answers that perhaps the establishment is not comfortable with. We're setting out to redate history, and the evidence certainly points to the fact that John West's theory is correct.
An older Sphinx would drastically revise our current view of man's early history. Are we heirs to a richer legacy than we ever dreamed of, from a civilization not of hunter-gatherers, but of great artists, architects, and scientists? A civilization in command of technologies we do not yet understand and cannot reproduce. Perhaps there were Egyptians before the flood, Some think they were Atlanteans. But whoever they were, the Sphinx stands in mute testimony to their existence.